out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
Somewhere near the coast, Marv's boots hit the dirt road hard as he trudged closer to the pitiful excuse for a town called Mystfall. He didn't have high hopes. Small towns were always bad news. Too many suspicious stares, too few taverns, and definitely not enough women willing to be charmed by a ranger with a past like his. At least the local gang back in Westport, the Black Sails, was paying well for this contract. Just one old dragonkin elder to track and deliver alive. He'd been at it for weeks, and the trail was like a bad hangover. Slow, painful, and full of regret. The crystal they'd given him to signal the job's end felt like a magical afterthought. Pointed at the sky, his contractors would pop in, grab the mark, and drop off his hefty reward. Marv hated magic. Too flashy and too unreliable. But despite all that, gold was gold. Rumours in every village whispered of strange tracks, big ones, like someone in the woods didn't get the memo that stomping around wasn't subtle. Marv didn't like how the trees creaked, how shadows clung a little longer than they should. He had a feeling the locals weren't just spooked for fun. And then there was the cold, that unnatural bite in the air that no amount of booze could shake off. Frost where there shouldn't be any, crops dead like a drunk gambler's wallet. It didn't sit right. Marv figured it was probably some sorcerer playing God in the woods again, shaking off a chill that crawled up his spine. Still, he needed a drink. Mystfall had better have a tavern. Ranging through these endless forests was thirsty work for Marv. Besides, with luck, the elder might show up, buying his last meal or making some final melodramatic speech about his ancestors. These types always had a flair for dramatic exits. Marv ran a hand through his mess of hair and sighed. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't here to fix anybody's problems. He was here to do what he always did, track, gamble, and survive long enough to spend his earnings in style. Far away in the northern reaches of the Darkwood, Ryvas knelt at the base of the shrine of the devouring shadow. His breath slow and measured as he listened to the stillness of the elder oaks. The carvings on the ancient shrine, depicting cycles of light and shadow, seemed to shift and breathe under the faint glow of moonlight. His eyes closed. He whispered a prayer to Mother Moon, his words both reverent and resolute. His mentor, the hunter, had spoken of moments like this. The man was a living legend, the last of the moon singers, those who had once guarded the sacred balance of nature with both fierce reverence and unrelenting power. Under his guidance, Ryvas had learned to command the wild forces of the earth, to walk unseen among ancient beasts, and to summon nature's wrath when needed. Yet today's task weighed on him more than any trial he had faced before. The vision had been undeniable. The hunter, his teacher, and closest guide would die by another's hand, and it would be Ryvas's fate to walk alongside the one responsible. It was Mother Moon's will, cryptic as always, but sacred nonetheless. His path had led him here, to this shrine, in the heart of the woodland. He would wait for the path to reveal itself. Faith demanded patience. The hunter had often spoken of the trials moonsingers faced, moments when their faith in nature's balance would be challenged beyond reason. This was such a trial, and he knew it. Somewhere out there, in the tangled maze of the elder oak trees, his destiny was entwining with that of another, the one who would bring death to his mentor. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a soft, ethereal glow. For a moment, the crushing weight of the forest's silence lifted, replaced by a soothing warmth that filled his entire being. He felt weightless, as though the burdens of his mortal body had faded into the night air. It was as if the moon herself had reached down to embrace him. Rising slowly, Ryvas brushed the dirt from his hands and whispered a final invocation to Mother Moon. He would not fail her. His path, though shrouded in mystery, was clear in purpose. Balance must be preserved. Whether by light or shadow, he would see it through. His journey into the depths of fate had truly begun. Ryvas surrendered to the swell of moonlight that had swallowed him. Back near the coast after a long stalk through woods, bogs and fields, Marv entered Mystfall, the town as underwhelming as he'd expected. Old stone buildings slumped tiredly around the square, patched and rebuilt so many times they looked ready to collapse out of sheer exhaustion. At the centre stood some larger weather-beaten structure, probably important once, but now just another relic of a place going nowhere fast. He made his way to the market, passing a few stalls selling the essentials, dried goods, herbs and tools nobody would ever call quality. He bought supplies without fuss, a bundle of dried meat, some oats, and basic rations. The matron at the stall watched him with narrow eyes, suspicion practically radiating off her. He didn't bother hiding his purpose, asking if the town had seen fewer travellers lately. Her response, clipped and cautious, confirmed it. He wasn't surprised. A town like this probably only attracted trouble, and people like him. With his errands done, Marv set his sights on the tavern. It was exactly as he hoped, warm, smoky, and stocked with ale strong enough to burn the frost from his bones. He slipped inside, ordered a drink, and found a spot near the corner. The ale arrived quick, thick, bitter, and entirely too strong for its taste. But that was fine by him. He sipped it slowly, easing into a practiced look of blissful contentment, as if he'd found heaven in the bottom of his mug. His posture sagged just enough to suggest he was deep in his cups. It was a trick, of course, and his eyes remained sharp under his half-lidded gaze. He scanned the room without turning his head. It wasn't long before he noticed two men whispering in a corner. They weren't loud, but they weren't subtle either. One of them, shifting nervously, stood and made for the door. Marv's focus narrowed. The man's drink was untouched, the food on his plate barely picked at. Nobody left a full pint unless something serious was pushing them out the door. That was the confirmation Marv needed. He drained the rest of his ale and tossed a coin onto the bar. Contracts were contracts, even small ones like this. He paid what he owed, always. Outside, the man was already out of sight, vanishing faster than a rat down a hole. The second sign. Marv's instincts were humming now. He pulled the crystal from his pocket, turning it toward the sky. The thing lit up, and wizard magic did what wizard magic always did, something flashy and inconvenient. A beam of light shot skyward, cutting through the mist like a blade. He squinted against the sudden glare, already regretting this nonsense. Then a portal opened. From it stepped a tall, gaunt man dressed in a long, colourful coat. A wizard, clearly. Maybe not the cleanest wizard. Marv sighed inwardly. Wizards always had to make an entrance. He wanted his gold, plain and simple, not a parade of magical theatrics. More portals blinked open across the clearing. Figures emerged, armed, grim, and not remotely friendly. Marv's eyes darted to each in turn. They weren't here to admire the scenery. His hand instinctively gripped his bow. The tall wizard approached, his movements leisurely, as if he had all the time in the world. He praised Marv's work, noting that he'd accomplished what their people had failed to do for months. There was no mention of payment. The wizard stood there silent and expectant. Marv's eyes narrowed further. Something wasn't right. He barely heard the shout from behind him as a group of bandits called for there to be no witnesses. Marv spun with a curse and ducked for the nearest cover, his instincts well honed. Ice shards shattered the air where Marv had stood a moment before. He ducked low, rolled to the side, and notched an arrow in one fluid motion. There was one kind of people he hated more than people trying to kill him. That was going to happen from time to time. No, Marv hated even more the kind of people who owed him money. No honor, no integrity. The arrow loosed with a satisfying twang, striking the wizard in the shoulder before he could conjure another spell. Marv was already moving, eyes scanning for cover as the clearing erupted into chaos. So much for a simple job. This wasn't ideal. In fact, it was a first-class fuck-up, but Marv had survived worse. It was time to see if this lot had ever faced a real bounty hunter. As the white moonlight unwrapped him, Ryvas emerged into chaos, his senses overwhelmed by the sharp tang of blood and smoke. The world spun in disorientation, and for a moment he didn't know where he was. The air carried a faint saltiness, suggesting a town near the coast, though the scene before him looked more like a battlefield. Looters and ruffians stormed the streets, smashing windows and dragging screaming townsfolk from their homes. Buildings crackled and popped as flames licked through wooden beams. Screams of fear mingled with the jeering laughter of the attackers. It was pandemonium, a scene out of nightmare. Then came the call, a chilling chorus of voices shouting that there should be no witnesses. Bolts and fire spells rained toward him. His instincts roared to life, drowning out the confusion. Without hesitation, Ryvas's form twisted and expanded, his body elongating, fur bursting forth. Within seconds, he had taken the form of a massive Sabertooth Tigre. The attackers froze, eyes widening in terror as the druid beast let out a guttural snarl. The first bandit wasn't quick enough to flee. Ryvas lunged and sank his fangs deep into the man's throat, silencing his cries. Blood sprayed, hot and metallic, as the man collapsed in a heap. More screams erupted as the looters scattered in every direction. Ryvas didn't wait. He leapt into a plume of smoke, vanishing from sight in the haze. His muscles shifted once more as he assumed the form of an owl. Wings beat silently against the rising heat, lifting him above the chaos. From this vantage, the scale of destruction became clear. People were being dragged from homes and shops. Entire streets burned, their glow like veins of molten fury snaking through the town. Movement caught his eye, an elven figure firing arrows with remarkable speed and precision. The ranger's arrows punched through bandits with deadly efficiency, each strike finding its mark. An ally, perhaps. Ryvas wasn't alone. Then he spotted a towering dragonkin in the midst of a brawl, a brutal force of nature in his own right. The dragonkin swung a massive weapon, crushing a bandit's knee with a sickening crack. The man crumpled in agony as the dragonkin roared and engaged two more attackers, his movements a blur of strength and savagery. Ryvas dove back into the smoke, twisting once more into the saber-tooth form. His claws dug deep into the earth as he bounded through the choking haze, positioning himself for another strike. He caught sight of a bandit closing in on the elven ranger and didn't hesitate. With a burst of speed, Ryvas launched himself at the man, crushing him under his weight. His claws raked across the bandit's chest, tearing through armor and flesh with ease. As he crouched for the next attack, Ryvas heard the faintest remark from the ranger, something like "good kitty," spoken with casual amusement before the elf ducked behind cover to unleash another volley of arrows. The dragonkin's grunt of exertion echoed through the smoke. He was still locked in brutal combat, surrounded but holding his ground with relentless fury. Ryvas surged forward once more, smoke curling around his hulking form. One ally was accounted for. Now he would reach the other fighter. Tonight, Ryvas would be more than a protector. He would become the shadow of nature's wrath, silent and deadly in the firelit streets. The bandits would come to fear the smoke itself before this was over. Marv kept repeating the same mantra in his mind. They backstabbed the wrong ranger. Marv hated betrayal as much as he hated crossbows, and gods, did he hate crossbows. Slow, clunky, and wielded by amateurs. As bolts thudded into the dirt around him, he took quick stock of the situation. At least 24 attackers. None particularly dangerous on their own, but there were too many for his liking. He mentally counted his arrows. Enough for now, but not for long. He'd have to make every shot count. He dashed forward, boots skidding on loose gravel as he loosed an arrow at a crossbow man. The shaft buried itself in the man's forearm with a satisfying crack. That was one fewer threat. Marv spun, knocking the butt of his bow into the jaw of a dagger-wielding rogue lunging at him. The thug stumbled back, cursing through broken teeth. Then Marv saw it, just out of the corner of his eye. A mage, hands crackling with arcane energy, stood in the open and was already beginning the incantation for a spell. Marv's muscles tensed, knowing he wouldn't reach cover in time. He hated mages. Too fast, too unpredictable. But something else reached the mage first. Out of the thick smoke burst a massive fur-covered form, a Sabertooth Tigre of all things. Marv stared, slack-jawed, as the beast collided with the mage and dragged him down in a flurry of claws and fangs. The mage barely had time to scream before the tiger ripped into him like a butcher tearing through fresh game. Blood sprayed and Marv blinked, trying to wrap his head around it. Was that a real-life goddamn tiger? He snapped back to the scene and got to work. His instincts kicked in before his brain caught up. Good kitty, he muttered reflexively, the words escaping like a habit from days when weird things didn't make him blink anymore. The tiger didn't stick around. It vanished back into the smoke, leaving Marv to deal with the next wave of attackers. But then he heard something else through the din, grunting and the clash of metal. Someone was still fighting, holding their ground not far off. Squinting through the haze, Marv caught glimpses of a hulking figure wielding an enormous axe. The stranger stood near a battered hovel, battling 2 attackers with brutal efficiency. Whoever he was, he fought like a berserker, his blows sending sparks and splinters flying. All right, Marv thought. It was time to make a new friend. He ducked low and moved from cover to cover, keeping his bow ready as he approached the massive warrior. If this stranger could keep fighting like that, Marv figured they might just survive this mess after all. Ryvas darted into the open square near an old stone well, bolts and magic blasts whizzing past him like angry hornets. The warrior in the middle of the square fought with brutal precision, each swing of his massive axe smashing weapons and ribs alike. The air was thick with smoke and blood, but Ryvas sensed another presence joining the fight, a scent carried on the wind. It was the ranger. The man materialized from the haze like a ghost, eyes sharp and longbow already loosing arrows at their enemies. Now they were 3. Bandits and mages, at least a dozen, encircled them like wolves closing in for the kill. The 3 fighters didn't hesitate. They went to work, a fluid machine of survival and vengeance. Arrows flew, claws tore, and the great axe cleaved through enemy ranks. But then Ryvas caught something strange through the carnage. Behind the hovel, just beyond the line of fire, a group of bandits was dragging someone away. He inhaled deeply and could almost taste the fear on the air. The hostage hadn't been cut down like the others. This was different. He locked eyes with the dragonkin warrior at the same moment. The towering fighter saw it too, and the shift in his posture was immediate. His attacks became fiercer, more desperate, as if the hostage's fate burned in his mind. The axe he wielded flared with radiant light, an aura of divine fury cutting through the smoky gloom. A paladin, Ryvas realized, instinct screaming at him to act. This warrior was no ordinary brute. He wasn't here just for survival, he was fighting for something sacred. Marv caught sight of a hostage being hauled by two bandits. They were dragging his bounty, the older dragonkin, out of range for his longbow. He had maybe a dozen arrows left, and wasting them on a long shot wasn't an option. The men in front of him still needed killing. But the scene hit him like a bad fever dream. First, a Sabertooth Tigre had saved his hide, and now there was a massive dragonkin warrior hacking through bandits with a glowing axe. A paladin, of all things. Marv shook his head in disbelief, ducking a firebolt and returning the favour with a swift arrow to a mage's chest. He muttered under his breath about another glorious damned mess while knocking an arrow. His arm burned from the fight, his legs ached from all the movement, and for a brief moment he longed for his earlier problem, a crappy ale at the local tavern. Hell, he'd even take the bitter stuff if it meant not being in the middle of a battlefield surrounded by lunatics with magic and bad attitudes. But here he was. He spat on the ground, dodged another blast of magic, and pushed forward. If they wanted to make it through this, they'd need to get to that hostage fast. Marv glanced at the tiger. Well, whatever the hell it was now, then at the dragonkin paladin. No point in dying before introductions. Ryvas stood over the broken form of a bandit, his claws still extended and stained with blood. The battle was over. Dead bandits littered the ground like fallen leaves, their twisted bodies sprawled in the dirt. The wounds he and his allies bore stung with every breath, but they remained upright, battle instincts keeping them alert, and the tide had turned. The Sabertooth's rage still surged within Ryvas like a burning torrent, demanding more violence. He wrestled with it, letting his druidic discipline take control. Slowly, the primal fury receded, replaced by the quiet stillness he had learned from years under the hunter's guidance. Balance was key, rage and reason, beast and man. Nearby, the dragonkin paladin drove his axe into the chest of his final opponent, ending the fight with brutal finality. The ranger, swift and unrelenting, knocked an arrow to take down another, hitting the bandit square in the knee. The wounded man screamed before the paladin's glowing weapon silenced him for good. Ryvas glanced through the smoke and saw one remaining bandit fleeing into the distance, his figure already fading into the swirling haze. The ranger was already tracking him, raising his bow for a long-range shot. Ryvas held his breath, but the opportunity slipped away. The bandit was gone. Panting, Ryvas exhaled and let his form shift once more. Fur melted away, replaced by his true self, standing tall and composed despite the strain of his transformations. He walked forward to meet the others as they approached. The paladin, towering and silent, watched him with a steady, unreadable gaze. The divine aura still flickered faintly around his axe, though he made no immediate move to speak. The ranger, on the other hand, showed no concern over the sudden change from tiger to man. If anything, he looked vaguely amused, casually wiping blood from his sleeve. The silence stretched until the ranger, with a tired grin, broke it. He asked if anyone else was thirsty, his voice rough and deadly serious. Ryvas chuckled softly despite himself. Marv's eyes scanned the scene, and everything was looted. The tavern, a crime against all things good and decent, was on fire. Marv winced as he touched the gash on his arm. He was bleeding and, worst of all, out 2,000 gold pieces. The job was officially a disaster. Some villagers scrambled through the ruins, dragging survivors from burning homes. Others stared at the wreckage with hollow eyes. It was too late for a lot of them. Desperation had driven the bandits here, and desperate people made for dangerous enemies. The druid seemed all right, despite having transformed into a giant tiger moments ago. Marv glanced at the towering dragonkin next. He was still silent, his radiant axe dimming as the last flickers of divine energy faded. No way in hell this big one was the dragonkin elder Marv had been tracking. He couldn't have hidden this paladin anywhere. He stood out like a siege tower in a wheat field. Definitely not a coincidence they had both ended up here, though. Marv wiped the sweat and soot from his face, then turned to the druid. He asked how the guy had ended up in the middle of all this. The druid gave his name, Ryvas, and then his answer. Marv wasn't surprised to hear magic was involved. Of course it was. Great. Just what he needed. More magic nonsense. The dragonkin finally spoke, his voice deep and steady. He introduced himself as Zyrrath and confirmed he'd also been brought here by magic. Wonderful. Marv rolled his eyes. This whole mess was practically a wizard's festival. But something shifted in the air as Zyrrath mentioned where he'd come from. It was subtle. A tightening of Ryvas's posture, a brief narrowing of his eyes. Marv caught it, though. Years of reading people taught him to notice the small things. Whatever Zyrrath had said hit a nerve with the druid. Now that was interesting. The three of them spoke briefly, trading fragments of their stories. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but they agreed on one thing. They needed to figure out what the hell had happened here. Bandits didn't usually roll into town with mages and organized squads unless something bigger was in play. Marv kept his part of the puzzle to himself. He had been speaking with someone in Mystfall before this all kicked off. That much was true. He didn't see any reason to mention why just yet. Best to hold on to that information until he knew more about his new companions. Trust was earned, after all. For now, they had work to do. Ryvas eyed a group of survivors stumble toward them, led by an older woman who moved with a painful limp. Blood stained her torn clothes, but her eyes remained sharp, unbroken by the horrors around her. He watched as she and the others approached cautiously, their expressions a mix of fear and gratitude. One of the villagers carried a small case, and when it was opened, several healing potions were revealed. Another man handed a few of the vials to the three of them, without hesitation. Ryvas frowned. For a village this remote and impoverished, having this many potions on hand was unusual. Supplies like that didn't just appear by chance. Something was off. He stepped forward and asked the question directly. What happened here? The elder met his gaze without flinching. Despite her wounds and age, there was a keen intelligence behind her eyes. She explained that they had been hiding someone important, an elder dragonkin, a chronicler, keeper of ancient histories. Ryvas noticed the way Zyrrath's entire posture changed. His eyes sharpened, narrowing on the woman like a blade drawn in silence. The paladin's deep voice broke the stillness as he asked if he was from the western continents. The elder hesitated, her gaze lingering on him for a long moment, before she gave a subtle nod. Something unsaid passed between them. She continued, revealing that a group of village leaders had been hiding the chronicler for months, moving him from place to place to keep him safe. Ryvas caught the small shift in Marv's stance at this, the ranger's casual demeanour briefly cracking. His reaction wasn't lost on Ryvas. The village elder's tone hardened with urgency. She didn't beg, but her voice carried a command born of experience. She directed them to return the chronicler from the clutches of the bandits. There was an importance to the directive that hinted at the importance of the task, more than the possible love of a friend. Ryvas didn't need his heightened senses to understand the stakes. Whoever this chronicler was, the village had risked everything to protect him. Now he was gone, dragged away by the same bandits they'd just fought. Zyrrath straightened, his large frame radiating a quiet intensity. There was no question that he was ready to act. The ranger, however, spat on the ground with a bitter grimace. Marv couldn't believe his ears. Get him back. He was outraged, though he hid most of it behind a grimace. He stared at the old woman, sharp-eyed and all business. But that was still a huge ask. Villagers always had a way of dumping these grand, noble missions on adventurers like it was nothing. He glanced at Ryvas, figuring the druid was one of those types, the kind who'd help just because it was the right thing to do. And then there was Zyrrath. Marv wasn't sure of the full story, but it was obvious the dragonkin was somehow connected to the missing chronicler. Probably didn't know him personally, but there were ties there. Too much history in the air for it to be a coincidence. Marv decided to get to the point. He asked the question flatly. How much? The villagers recoiled, shocked that anyone would ask about payment at a time like this. Ryvas tensed and gave him a disapproving glance. Marv didn't much care. He was counting on Zyrrath being more practical. The paladin didn't flinch. Good. That was a sign Marv had pegged him right, someone who understood the value of transactions and good business sense. The elder didn't scoff either. She had that knowing look, the one that said she'd seen her share of mercenaries and men who needed incentive to risk their necks. As expected, she rambled a bit. Something about a greater purpose and sacrifices for the good of all. Marv tuned most of it out. He'd heard it before. Eventually she cut to the chase. 1,000 gold. Marv raised an eyebrow, half of what he'd originally been promised, but better than nothing. He sized up his options. Maybe it'd be a split between the three of them, or maybe just two. He could probably talk Ryvas out of taking a share. The druid seemed like the type who'd wave it off, content with the satisfaction of doing a good deed. Marv smirked inwardly. That'd be fine with him. The potions did their job well enough. The gash on his arm had sealed up, and he felt steady again. No more bleeding, no more throbbing pain. He rolled his shoulder, satisfied. It was time to do what he did best. Negotiations handled, Marv mentally shifted gears. This was now a hunt, and he loved a good hunt. His senses sharpened, taking in the scents of smoke and earth, the disturbed tracks of bandits retreating into the woods. His hand rested lightly on his bow as he exhaled slowly. The trail wouldn't stay fresh for long, and just like that, the three of them disappeared into the trees. It was now time to catch something. Ryvas and Marv took the lead, their strides quiet and measured as they tracked their prey through the dense forest. Ryvas had to admit that Marv was skilled, moving almost as silently as the druid himself. Rangers and druids often shared an instinctive bond with nature, and Marv's ease in the woods reflected that. They didn't need many words to communicate. The hunt bound them to a shared purpose. The bandits hadn't done a great job of covering their tracks. It was hard to do while dragging a hostage, and the trail was clear enough. Trampled brush, snapped twigs, and the occasional scuff in the dirt. Still, Ryvas kept thinking back to the one bandit who had escaped earlier. If that man had reached his group, they'd be warned by now. A trap wasn't just possible. It was likely. Behind them, Zyrrath followed, his presence heavy and loud despite his best efforts. The dragonkin wasn't built for subtlety. Ryvas and Marv stayed well ahead, allowing the paladin to move at his own pace without giving away their position. Marv, ever skeptical, had given the owl a side-eye when it first appeared, clearly unconvinced it was a good idea. But Ryvas knew better. Owls were common in these forests, and at dusk they blended seamlessly with the fading light. No one would think twice about seeing one. They had been walking for hours when Marv suddenly halted. Ryvas stopped in sync, his eyes narrowing as he followed the ranger's gaze. Marv knelt by a patch of disturbed earth, revealing a well-concealed trap, thin wires and spikes hidden beneath a layer of leaves. It wasn't fresh. That sent a chill through Ryvas. This trap had been laid long before the bandits fled, which meant they'd been preparing for something bigger. Zyrrath finally caught up and examined the trap with a thoughtful frown. He agreed with Ryvas's suspicion. If there were pre-planned traps here, there could be more defences further ahead. Possibly reinforcements, too. The paladin's axe gleamed faintly in the dim light as he nodded toward the path ahead, signalling readiness. Ryvas and Marv exchanged a look, both scanning their surroundings carefully. No signs of bandits or any other movement nearby. It was eerily quiet now, the last glimmers of daylight slipping below the trees. Shadows deepened and the air grew cooler. That's when Ryvas caught it. Something faint but distinct carried on the breeze. He sniffed again, this time certain. A smell, like blood and sweat. Human fear. His senses sharpened as he motioned silently to Marv. Whatever lay ahead, it was close. The druid wasn't bad in the woods. Marv could admit that much. He wasn't a ranger, though. There was a difference between knowing the forest and living in it. Still, Ryvas moved well and had solid instincts. Marv appreciated that. The paladin, however, was another story. Zyrrath moved like a bull blundering through a temple full of delicate relics, his heavy footfalls and clanking armor giving away his every move. Ryvas had been right to trust his senses. Marv's sharp eyes soon caught movement ahead. He signaled to Ryvas to move up quietly, while leaving Zyrrath further behind. Together, they crept through the underbrush, slipping between the trees until the view opened before them. A dug-out bandit camp lay sprawled in a small clearing. Trenches encircled the area, reinforced by hastily built wooden palisades. A few sagging tents dotted the center of the camp. Marv's gaze shifted to two guards patrolling near the entrance. They moved lazily, clearly not expecting trouble. Poor bastards. They probably didn't even know the full scale of the situation they were in. Marv doubted they had anything close to the 1,000 gold he was owed on them. That was too bad for their survival prospects. The two of them scanned the camp a little longer before slipping back to Zyrrath. Marv crouched low near the paladin and rested an elbow on his knee as he laid out a plan. Ryvas and Marv returned to Zyrrath, quietly explaining what they had seen. The camp was well fortified with trenches and palisades, and the guards were carrying bone-carved horns. Those horns, Ryvas noted grimly, would be used to blare an alarm at the first sign of trouble. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Zyrrath listened carefully. He didn't say much, but the questions he asked were sharp, tactical, and to the point. He understood the stakes immediately. The paladin gave a curt nod when they laid out the plan. Each of them would play to their strengths. If executed properly, they'd neutralize the guards without giving the camp time to react. The first step was Ryvas turning into an owl. He would fly overhead and distract one of the guards, drawing his attention away from the perimeter. Marv, with his hunter's confidence, planned to take out the same guard with 2 rapid arrows. He seemed sure he could fire both before the first even hit. Ryvas had to admit, the ranger was an impressive marksman. While Marv took his shot, Zyrrath would charge the second guard head-on. The distraction and ambush would give Ryvas the perfect opportunity to transform once more, this time into a Sabertooth Tigre. He would strike from the flank, tearing into the guard before he could even think to reach for his horn. If their timing held, neither bandit would live long enough to raise the alarm. Satisfied with the plan, the 3 spread out and took their positions. Ryvas breathed deeply, centering himself in the stillness of the forest. This was balance, each of them moving in sync with the natural flow of the hunt. As he prepared to shift into his owl form, he could already feel the moonlight within him, guiding his purpose. With a silent nod to his companions, Ryvas took to the sky. The hunt was on. Marv saw the druid take off into the sky, his owl form disappearing into the growing shadows. Meanwhile, Zyrrath did something unexpected. He removed his armor to move more quietly. Smart. The big guy didn't talk much, but when he did, it mattered. Marv appreciated someone who knew when to shut up and conserve their breath. Marv kept low, eyes fixed on the camp. He saw Ryvas perch silently on a branch above the first guard. The man didn't even glance up. So far, the plan was going smoothly. Then, without warning, the owl dove straight at the ground, snatching up a small ferret in its talons. That did the trick. The guard's head snapped toward the sudden motion, distracted by the commotion. That was all Marv needed. His bowstring sang as 2 arrows flew in quick succession. The first struck the guard's neck, and the second buried itself deep in his chest. No neck, no cry, no lung, no horns blaring. The man dropped silently, his body collapsing in a heap before it even had time to thud against the dirt. Marv shifted his gaze toward the other side of the camp just in time to see Ryvas get to work. The owl shifted mid-flight, transforming into a blur of muscle and fur. By the gods, that tiger could move. The second guard barely had time to register the threat before Ryvas hit him like a storm, claws tearing into flesh. The guard's scream was cut short by the weight of the beast on top of him. Zyrrath appeared next, emerging silently from the bushes with surprising speed for someone his size. The paladin's axe glinted in the dim light as he brought it down in a clean final strike, finishing the job. The second guard hit the ground with a muffled thud, no louder than a log being tossed onto a campfire. Marv exhaled slowly. Normally he worked alone. Too many people just got in the way. But these two, they weren't half bad. This might actually go smoother than he'd expected. He nocked another arrow and prepared for the next phase of the plan. The camp wouldn't stay clueless forever. Marv checked the dead guard and cursed as he found more of nothing, not a copper to shake. Ryvas had also checked the other body he saw, and came up with keys. All right, thought Marv. Maybe there was at least something worth locking up. Ryvas was glad that the plan had gone off smoothly. The arrows found their mark with deadly precision, the hunter once again showing his impressive skill. Ryvas knew that no matter how disciplined guards might be, the primal spectacle of nature, an owl diving for prey, was always enough to distract them. He hadn't harmed the ferret he had caught, just scared the poor creature, but it had served its purpose well. He noticed that Zyrrath had removed his armor earlier to move more silently, a wise move. The paladin's final strike had been swift and powerful, a clean death for the bandit. A mercy, though Ryvas doubted Zyrrath had seen it that way. More likely, the paladin had done it purely to keep to the plan and maintain the silence. Still in his Sabertooth Tigre form, Ryvas sniffed the air, his senses expanding through the dark forest. The fear of other animals was palpable, carried on the wind. His own presence, massive and predatory, was enough to unsettle the wildlife nearby. The sharp scent of fresh blood lingered in the air, but there were no other signs of guards, no movement, no whispered voices, just eerie silence. Despite this, Ryvas crept forward with caution, his powerful frame moving silently through the underbrush. He stalked toward one of the tents near the edge of the camp, while Marv shadowed him, moving toward another. Zyrrath, unarmored but no less formidable, took position near the largest tent in the center. Ryvas sniffed the air again and surveyed the camp. Judging by the size of the tents, perhaps 6 guards had been stationed here at most. But many more bandits had attacked Mystfall. Something didn't add up about the camp they were in. The tent Ryvas searched was empty, just a bedroll and some scattered supplies. The occupant clearly had not returned. He growled softly to himself and shifted back into his humanoid form. From across the camp, Marv emerged from his own search and shook his head. The ranger gave a slight shrug, muttering something about the lack of gold. Typical of a bounty hunter, Ryvas thought. Always true to their priorities. He thought about the keys he had found. So far, there were no chests and nothing to lock. That pointed to something they hadn't yet found. He kept searching, keeping quiet. It was Zyrrath who broke the silence. His voice, low and steady, carried across the camp as he called them over. He had found something in the larger tent. Ryvas and Marv exchanged a glance and moved quickly to join him. Whatever Zyrrath had discovered, Ryvas could feel that it was important. Marv shook his head in disbelief. Not a single copper, silver or gold coin anywhere in that camp. He wasn't just angry. This defied all logic. Bandits didn't work for free. Hell, even the lowest thieves expected payment for the risk. It was a universal truth in his world, just like bad tavern ale and overpriced brothels. This meant only one thing: the camp was hiding something. Maybe it wasn't coin, but it had to be worth protecting. Whatever it was, Zyrrath had apparently found it. Marv sighed and followed Ryvas, who had returned to his human form, as they made their way to the large central tent. Inside they found the usual stockpile: crates of dry food, water casks, and bedrolls. Standard supplies for a group on the move. But beneath one of the crates, sure enough, they found it. A trap door. Of course, it was always a trap door. Bandits were predictable, if nothing else. Marv couldn't decide if he was impressed by the consistency or just exhausted by the lack of creativity. Before Zyrrath could rip the door open, Marv grabbed his arm to stop him. The big guy seemed almost too eager, and that was a red flag. Zyrrath didn't argue, but Marv could see the tension in his shoulders. The paladin wanted in that hidden passage badly, probably chasing his own answers. Marv knew that look. Zyrrath wasn't just in this for the fight. He was searching for something personal. Maybe not gold, but something that weighed heavy on his mind. Marv knelt by the door and carefully inspected it. Tripwires, pressure triggers, anything that might leave them missing limbs or worse, owing favours to a healer. To his relief, it was clear. No hidden surprises. As he stood and stepped back, he gave Zyrrath a nod. The guy had slipped up in his eagerness, letting his emotions cloud his caution. Marv filed that little detail away. Everyone had their pressure points, and Zyrrath's were starting to show. Ryvas saw it too, Zyrrath's urgency, the way the paladin had nearly ripped the trapdoor apart to get inside. There was a tension in his movements, a restrained rage that made the air around him feel heavier. Zyrrath was not just here to break a few bones. He was searching for something deeper, something that clearly mattered to him in ways Marv's pursuit of gold did not. That urgency was familiar. Ryvas had seen it before in his mentor, the hunter, during those final months in the Darkwood. His mentor had spoken of duty to the natural world, to protect the balance at any cost. But that balance had slipped into bloodshed, and innocent lives had been taken. Ryvas had wrestled with those choices ever since. Nature operated on its own brutal terms, but his mentor's actions had gone beyond the laws of the wild. Now here was Zyrrath, a paladin bound to divine principles, yet fighting with something more raw, vengeful anger. Ryvas could feel it in the way the dragonkin swung his axe in battle. For someone sworn to justice or mercy, Zyrrath fought as though each strike was meant to settle a deeply personal score. The similarity to his mentor's rage unsettled Ryvas more than he cared to admit. With Marv's inspection finished and the trap clear, Zyrrath dropped into the hidden passage without hesitation. Ryvas followed, landing silently on packed dirt, the faint scent of freshly disturbed earth filling his senses. Marv came last, his bow at the ready as they surveyed their surroundings. The corridor stretched into darkness, its walls uneven and hastily dug. This was not some ancient hideout. It was new, maybe a few months old at most. The ground was hardened from use, but claw and tool markings were still faintly visible on the walls. Whoever had built this tunnel had done so in a hurry, and for a specific purpose. They exchanged glances, their decision unspoken but unanimous. They would head right. The corridor sloped upward slightly, leading deeper into the unknown. Ryvas took point, his senses heightened, sniffing for any sign of life or danger ahead. His thoughts lingered on Zyrrath's silent intensity. He could not ignore the parallels between this paladin's path and the one his mentor had walked before his death. The natural world was cruel, yes, but now Ryvas had to wonder, was this journey also leading them toward another line that should not be crossed? The corridor stretched on, and Marv's sharp eyes picked up details as they moved. The paths had been well travelled. He estimated a few dozen people had walked these tunnels recently. That fit with the size of the force that had attacked Mystfall. Everything was checking out so far. The passage eventually led them to a junction with doors on either side. They paused, silently exchanging glances. All three had caught the same scent in the air, fire and something cooking. It wasn't strong, but it was there, a faint trace carried on the stagnant underground air. Marv moved to the door on the left and pressed his ear to it. Nothing. No voices, no movement, just the quiet crackle of fire beyond the thick wood. He glanced back at Ryvas and Zyrrath, both of whom nodded silently, ready to move. Slowly, Marv pushed the door open, careful not to make a sound. The small room inside was empty. He scanned it quickly, nothing out of place. A long wooden table sat in the centre, but it was bare, not even a cup or plate on it. A small fire crackled softly in the corner, a cooking pot suspended over the flames, with the smoke venting through an iron pipe embedded in the wall. Marv's mind worked quickly, piecing things together. The fire wasn't for a large group. This setup was meant to serve 1 or 2 people at most. Whoever had been here wasn't planning to sit down and eat with friends. It was temporary. A pit stop. But that also meant one thing. They had to be coming back. He muttered his thoughts quietly to Ryvas and Zyrrath. They agreed with a shared understanding in their eyes. There wasn't much else to be done. The ambush was set. Marv and Ryvas took up positions along the walls while Zyrrath positioned himself behind the table, his axe resting silently in his hands. The fire crackled softly in the corner, the room filling with tense stillness as they waited. Marv's fingers hovered over his bowstring. They wouldn't have to wait long. Whoever was coming would soon learn the hard way that they'd walked into the wrong room. Ryvas waited patiently, his senses attuned to the stillness around him. Waiting was part of the hunt, a skill as natural to him as breathing. Yet the longer they remained in the room, the more the truth became clear. The pot over the fire boiled over, steam hissing softly as it dripped into the flames below. Whoever had prepared this meal wasn't coming back. The guards from above had been the intended recipients, and their absence was now permanent. If anyone else was in the tunnels, they weren't heading to the kitchens. He caught the eyes of Marv and Zyrrath. They exchanged silent nods. All 3 of them thought it was time to move on. Together, they carefully restored the room to its original state before slipping back into the corridor. The tension in the air remained, but they moved swiftly and quietly, like shadows in the dim light. The passage stretched ahead, turning sharply to the left and then right. They chose the right path, their steps light on the packed earth. At the end of the corridor, they found a door. Thick hardwood reinforced with steel joints and heavy hinges. This wasn't just a storage room or a random chamber. This door was built to hold someone, likely someone important. Ryvas approached and retrieved the keys they had taken from the dead guard. He slid one into the lock, and with a satisfying click, it turned. He glanced back at the others. Weapons were drawn, their eyes sharp. In silence, they prepared for whatever lay beyond the door. The door creaked as it opened, revealing a dimly lit room within. Seated against the wall, bound in heavy chains, was the elder dragonkin chronicler. Zyrrath's reaction was immediate. He strode into the room without hesitation, a rare and risky move for someone usually as calculated as he was. It was another unusual slip for a warrior, otherwise so practiced. Zyrrath unslung a massive hammer from his back, its surface etched with glowing green runes. He turned toward Ryvas and Marv, the unspoken intention clear in his eyes. He would break the chains. Marv moved to the corridor entrance, his bow drawn and ready to fire at anything that might come around the corner. Ryvas took his place between Zyrrath and the elder dragonkin, keeping watch as Zyrrath raised the hammer high. The air seemed to hum with energy as the weapon came crashing down onto the chains. The metal shattered on impact, fragments scattering across the room. Ryvas tensed, eyes narrowing as he took in the hammer more closely. The runes flared briefly with a pulsing green light. There was something unnatural about the weapon, something ancient and unknowable. It wasn't made of any material he could identify, and its aura prickled at the edge of his senses. Marv saw his mark fall to the floor, now free after the big guy had crushed the chains into nothing with some kind of charged hammer. The elder dragonkin slumped to the floor as the chains fell away, his breathing laboured but steady. He whispered something to Zyrrath, his gaze sharp and calculating. The words weren't meant for Marv's ears, but he caught fragments. Something about the Bloodfire or Bloodfire clan? A relative, maybe? The elder's eyes stayed locked on Zyrrath, hard and searching, as if seeing a ghost or the echo of someone else. Interesting. Marv narrowed his eyes, still watching the hall ahead. It didn't seem like Zyrrath knew this chronicler personally, but the chronicler clearly knew him. The little puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, though not completely. Family ties, blood debts. It was always something complicated with these kinds of situations. Marv didn't turn from his post but kept his ears tuned to the conversation. The old dragonkin spoke in hushed tones about how he'd been hiding for months, fleeing from people who wanted what he knew. They had been tracking him across this continent. That part piqued Marv's interest, though he kept his expression neutral. He wasn't going to mention that he'd been hired to find the Elder, at least not yet. Especially not while Zyrrath still had that hammer in his hand, glowing with whatever ancient magic-infused nonsense was powering it. He shifted slightly, keeping his grip steady on his bow as he listened for movement further down the hall. One of these two might figure out his involvement eventually, but Marv didn't plan on dying over it. He had gold to collect, and more importantly, gold to spend. He needed to live long enough to pry it out of whoever owed him. For now, he'd let this reunion play out, keeping his place in the shadows and his cards close to his chest. Ryvas sensed it, something shifting in the shadowy corridor, too fast to pinpoint. His instincts flared in warning, but before he could react, an invisible force collided with him. The impact threw him into Zyrrath, knocking both of them off balance. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud. The unseen assailant wasn't finished. Ryvas heard the footsteps rushing toward Marv, and then the sound of a solid hit as the invisible figure struck Marv's bow, knocking it aside. The bandit, or whatever it was, didn't stay to fight. Instead, he managed to slam the door shut and lock it from the outside. Ryvas immediately reached for the keys he'd used earlier, but it was too late. The door was sealed, and Marv was on the other side, likely cursing his luck. The situation had turned against them fast. He heard a deep, furious roar echoed through the chamber as the dragonkin's eyes flared with rage. Zyrrath gripped the massive hammer in both hands, its runes glowing fiercely. Without a word, he took a running charge at the door. The hammer came down with a crushing force, shattering steel as though it were brittle twigs. The door flew off its hinges, the metal groaning as fragments scattered into the corridor beyond. The way was open again. Marv, however, was splayed out under the door, only his hands and feet showing. To his credit, Ryvas noted he had managed to keep his longbow in hand. Ryvas exhaled, steadying himself as he scanned the shadows for any further signs of movement. Whatever had attacked them was gone for now, but the hunt had just escalated. They needed to stay on guard. Something powerful was in these tunnels, and it wouldn't give them another easy shot. He and Zyrrath moved to the heavy door laying on top of Marv. Just a few moments before, Marv had heard the stranger's running footsteps and whirled around, longbow ready. But there was nothing there, just shadows and the maddening sense of movement in the corner of his vision. Invisible, his rather poignant dislike of magic flared up. He might have fired a shot at the door, but knew better. He'd probably hit Ryvas or Zyrrath if he missed. And like it or not, he needed those two if any of them were going to make it out alive. Then something struck his longbow, knocking the arrow loose and throwing off his aim. That boiled his blood to a seething fury as he yelled out a curse against fucking cheating no-good magic folk. His eyes darted to the door just in time to see it swinging shut. He lunged forward to stop it, but wasn't fast enough. It slammed in his face with a solid thunk, now locked, of course. Ryvas had the keys with him, and Marv silently cursed both the druid and himself. He should have thought ahead about that little detail. He heard footsteps thundering from the other side, rapidly approaching the door. A part of him already knew what was coming. Me muttered under his breath, bracing for impact, that this was probably going to hurt a lot. It hit like a warhorse. The door exploded outward, and Marv barely registered the sound of steel and wood shattering before the force sent him flying. He hit the ground hard, the air driven from his lungs. The next thing he knew, Zyrrath and Ryvas were hauling the mangled door off of him, the elder dragonkin watching silently from behind them. Marv groaned, pushing himself up, dazed but alive. He shot the paladin a look that was equal parts gratitude and irritation. They quickly exchanged glances and the unspoken question, "Where now?" Marv voiced it aloud, and the answer came instantly. They had to make for the trap door. It was the only route that might still offer a way out. They sprinted back to the camp. The trap door loomed ahead, but things were worse than expected. The ladder was gone, and a heavy bar now sealed the door from above. Marv swore under his breath as he examined it. Time was slipping away, and they weren't the only ones on the hunt anymore. Ryvas saw plainly there was no getting through the trapdoor. It was barred and sealed tight, too high for the paladin to use his hammer with any leverage. Ryvas clenched his jaw, his frustration tempered by the need to stay focused. They turned back, heading for the unopened door across from the elder's cell. It was their only option left. He saw Marv move ahead of them, examining the door with practiced care. No traps, no locks. He gave a nod, and they slowly pushed it open. The faint sound of steel grinding on steel reached Ryvas's ears, a rhythmic scrape measured and unrelenting. The door creaked, revealing a dimly lit room lined with torches casting flickering shadows across rows of weapons. An armory. Weapons were stacked in careful order. Bows, lances, swords, plain but efficient. Nothing ornate, just solid utilitarian craftsmanship, meant to arm soldiers or mercenaries, enough to equip several brigades. Ryvas frowned. This was not the kind of cash you would expect from underground gangs. Most gangs used stealth and intimidation, not mass weaponry like this. His sharp senses drew him toward the source of the grinding. There, seated in the shadows, was a gigantic figure, a bugbear, colossal in size, even by his species' standards. Scars crisscrossed his muscular frame, like battle-worn stories carved into flesh. In his hands he held an enormous axe, slowly running a whetstone along the blade's edge with an almost lazy grace. The scraping continued as the bugbear's yellow eyes tracked them, unblinking, predatory. He did not pause his task, did not show any fear or alarm at their intrusion. Ryvas tensed, his hand drifting to his side, ready to shift forms at a moment's notice. Zyrrath gripped his own axe, stepping forward slightly. Marv, ever calm under pressure, knocked an arrow to his bowstring. The elder dragonkin moved behind them, watching the scene with quiet caution. The bugbear finally spoke, his voice low and flat. He remarked on the noise they had made, the racket that had disturbed his peace. He added, almost casually, that they had ruined his dinner earlier. But that was not much of a concern anymore. His gaze lingered on Zyrrath, and without a shred of humour, he mused aloud about eating dragon flesh, wondering what it might taste like when he was done. It was an honour, he said, to be Brutus the bugbear's meal. Ryvas's blood ran cold at the words. The bugbear was not bluffing. There was no mirth, no bravado in his tone, only grim certainty. The bugbear, calling himself Brutus, rose slowly, towering over even Zyrrath. His axe gleamed under the torchlight as he flexed his massive shoulders. Then he roared, the sound shaking the walls and reverberating through the tunnels like a shockwave of pure rage. Without hesitation, he charged. Brutus roared like an avalanche as he charged, his axe swinging with terrifying power. The first strike obliterated a thick hardwood table in a single swing, splinters flying like shrapnel. Marv immediately took note. That kind of raw force meant one thing. He'd need every object in the room between him and Brutus if he wanted to stay in one piece. Ryvas recognized the danger just as quickly. The bugbear's sheer size should have made him slower, but Brutus moved with unnatural speed. There was no choice. Ryvas had to transform. He called upon the last reserves of his druidic power and shifted into a Sabertooth Tigre. His muscles rippled with new strength, his senses sharpening as he prepared to strike. But even in this powerful form, he realized Brutus was faster than he had any right to be. No wonder this monster had been guarding the armory alone. Zyrrath was already on the move, charging into the fray with his axe raised high. The two giants collided in a brutal clash of steel and muscle. Zyrrath fought smart, never letting himself get pinned or cornered. His axe carved a deep gash across Brutus's arm, but the bugbear retaliated with a ferocious backhand swing. Zyrrath managed to block it, but the force sent him stumbling, his forearm slashed open. His axe clattered to the floor as he was knocked backward, blood dripping from the fresh wound. Marv cursed under his breath. 4 arrows were already sticking out of Brutus, but the beast wasn't slowing down. With Zyrrath momentarily out of the fight, Ryvas leapt into action. The Sabertooth Tigre lunged, claws slashing at Brutus's legs in an attempt to cripple him. Ryvas's instincts served him well. He dodged a wide swing of the axe. But Brutus was faster than expected. The bugbear's massive foot caught Ryvas squarely in the ribs, launching him into a brick wall with a bone-rattling crash. That left Marv to keep the fight going. He loosed another arrow, aiming for Brutus's shoulder, and immediately darted behind a stack of crates. Brutus snarled and charged, smashing aside anything in his path. Marv barely managed to kick a barrel of spears out of the way as the axe came down. He spun away just in time, the blade carving deep into the floor where he'd stood moments before. Out of the corner of his eye, Marv saw the elder dragonkin enter the room, calmly retrieving Zyrrath's fallen axe. The chronicler handed it back to Zyrrath just as the paladin surged to his feet, shouting for the elder to get clear. Brutus turned toward the sound, his yellow eyes flashing with rage, now standing dead center in the room. This was their moment. Ryvas recovered from the blow, shaking off the daze. With a powerful leap, he pounced on Brutus's back, fangs digging into the bugbear's shoulder. Brutus roared in fury, twisting and flailing as he tried to throw Ryvas off. That was when Marv struck again. 2 more arrows flew, this time hitting Brutus's exposed side. The bugbear staggered, but still didn't fall. Zyrrath seized the opening. With a defiant roar, he charged and brought his axe down with both hands. The weapon, now glowing with radiant power, cut deep into Brutus's chest. The bugbear howled, staggering back, but still swung wildly. The axe struck a nearby pillar, shattering part of the stone in a final act of defiance. Ryvas clawed his way free and leapt clear as Marv fired another arrow, this time hitting Brutus in the throat. The bugbear gurgled, blood pouring from his wounds. He dropped to one knee, eyes blazing with fury even as his strength ebbed away. Zyrrath stepped forward for the finishing blow, his axe raised high. Brutus roared one last time as Zyrrath's axe cleaved through his neck, the sound echoing through the chamber like a fading storm. The bugbear collapsed to the floor, the fight finally over. The room was silent except for the crackling of distant torches and their ragged breathing. Marv lowered his bow, Ryvas shifted back to his humanoid form, and Zyrrath wiped blood from his axe. Brutus had gone down fighting, but he was down nonetheless. They exchanged glances, battered but victorious. Marv moved first to the dead Brutus. After poking him with his bow at a distance, he searched Brutus's massive body. Marv finally found something to lighten his mood. 300 gold pieces. At last, some pay, he thought. He suggested he hold on to it, a perfectly reasonable offer in his mind. Zyrrath, of course, wasn't having it. The big guy didn't say much, but his glare spoke volumes. Smart of him. Marv liked that Zyrrath wasn't as easy to fool as some of the muscle Marv had dealt with before. They ended up splitting the gold evenly, which was fine for now. In his mind, the bastards who hired him still owed him money, and Marv was going to get his due, as sure as Brutus was getting colder. By his accounting, Brutus was the second time his employers had tried to kill him. By his accounting, that meant they owed him 6,000 gold. 2 for the first contract, and 2 more. Marv sat on a crate and bandaged himself up, wincing as he wrapped a particularly deep cut on his arm. The last healing potion from the villagers helped bring some strength back to his limbs. The fight with Brutus had been brutal. He figured the untimely death of Brutus the bugbear, full of his arrows, would send a message in the underground. The room really was a bloody mess, the silver lining. One of the shelves that had been crushed by Brutus was hiding a secret door. Again, bandits were just so predictable. Ryvas was also bandaging himself up. It was a brutal contest, and his new charge, Zyrrath, was fearless. It was not just bravery, it bordered on reckless abandon. He had charged into Brutus like the concept of death did not apply to him. Ryvas pondered his mentor's cryptic words again. Why had he been told to protect this paladin? What was it about Zyrrath that required Ryvas's presence? The dragonkin's skill and raw strength were undeniable, but the purpose behind his role in this mission remained elusive. Whatever the reason, Ryvas knew he would not find his answers here in the chaos. For now, survival and regrouping were priorities. Once they reached safety, perhaps there would be time to ask the questions that gnawed at his mind. With Zyrrath patched up and the elder following behind them like some silent shadow, Marv took point and opened the secret door they'd found in the armory. It led into a narrow tunnel, an escape route or smuggling passage, no doubt. They followed it in tense silence, eventually emerging in the woods near the encampment. The tunnel's exit was hidden within a hollowed-out stump, cleverly concealed beneath tangled roots and moss. Marv figured that even the invisible mage from earlier might not have known about this exit. Whoever had orchestrated all this, the weapon cache, the bandit attack, and Brutus's lone guard duty, was likely tied to the people who had hired Marv in the first place. It made perfect sense. The best way to remove yourself from dark deeds was to keep your hands clean and let your underlings do the killing. If some of those underlings took each other out in the process, well, that was just good management. He had to admire the efficiency of it. Ryvas had taken point stepping out of the fake tree stump near the enemy camp. His sharp eyes saw nothing around, his ears perceived nothing out of the ordinary in the woods. The others followed and stepped out into the forest. The group needed to get back to the village quickly and without drawing attention. Ryvas and Marv took the lead, scouting the terrain while Zyrrath guarded the elder behind them. The forest stretched dark and watchful around them, but the path remained clear for now. It was not the time for conversation, but the questions still tugged at Ryvas's mind. He glanced briefly at Zyrrath. The paladin had become a central figure in this strange journey. Yet Ryvas still did not understand why his mentor and master had commanded him to follow this path. Whatever journey this dragonkin was on, his master's last request was absolute: to walk the path with him. He pushed those thoughts aside and stayed focused on the task. The answers would come in time. For now, they had to survive the night. Marv was glad the group found their rhythm quickly. Ryvas took point, moving like a ghost between trees and shadows. Marv followed a short distance behind, eyes and ears sharp for anything out of place. The druid was good. Damn good, actually. But Marv kept his own senses on full alert. When the path was clear, he'd signal for the others, and Zyrrath would lead the elder forward. They moved like this for a while, a steady, efficient pace. It wasn't Marv's usual speed for stalking prey, but it was workable. His mind drifted to thoughts of traps, ambushes, and who might still be hunting them. But no footsteps echoed through the woods. No shadows broke from the trees. He let out a breath through his nose, shaking his head as they approached the village's outskirts. Despite the ash and smoke clinging to the air, the sight brought a single thought to the front of his mind: ale. He had some gold now, enough at least to pay for a drink or two. Marv would collect his due, and he bet he could sucker Zyrrath and Marv into helping him do it. We end our tale today with Zyrrath, Marv and Ryvas arriving at the outskirts of Mystfall looking for answers. Until next time, fellow adventurers.